You're listening to the Political Book Show podcast.
Can ordinary people subvert lobbying and use it for their own ends? That's the idea behind Alberto Alemanno's new book, Lobbying for Change, a practical guide on how to become a citizen advocate. Thanks for joining me, Alberto.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so there's a statement in your book saying we need more lobbying, not less. That's liable to send a shiver up most people's spines. So can you explain what you mean?
Well, citizen lobbying is about enabling citizens to voice their concerns by tapping into the repertoire that is generally used by professional lobbyists, sending out letters to our representatives, holding them accountable through social media, starting off a campaign, an online petition. In short, is about making sure we connect with our elected representatives in between elections, something we usually do not do. And politicians seem not very much interested in interacting with citizens in between elections. All their concerns is about having us giving their trust before the elections start, but then they kind of forget about our own priority in instances. And my claim is that if citizens were slightly more aware and probably awake of what is happening in the policy process, the public interest would actually emerge from decisions that are taken every single day by our politicians.
Why do you think the public are so disconnected from the legislative process?
Well, citizens today, they feel less and less powerful when it comes to having their voice heard in the policy process. And this is a bit of a paradox because we have never been better positioned to actually improve the state of the world. We are more educated, we are definitely live longer than our ancestors, and we are also less deferential vis-a-vis public authorities. Yet, we feel that our voice is just not heard, and politicians are living in their own bubble, whereas we are living in our own communities. So there's a clear need to possibly reconnect our daily life with that of our politicians. And potentially, I would say this is the right time to do so because we feel that most of the values we cherish about our society, the fact that we are diverse, we live in a very pluralistic society in our liberal democracies across Europe, are currently attacked by people who are questioning the scientific method. They are questioning even the principle of representative democracy by claiming that forms of direct democracy would actually serve better our interest. And my claim is that at the end of the day is not about competing models of democracy that we should decide, but is rather to reinvent the model of representative democracy by establishing models that are not competing one another. Citizen lobbyists are not antagonizing our electeds, but they are rather complementing their job by facilitating their task of representing our own instances.
Your book is kind of like a how-to book, like a manual for people who want to get involved in local campaigns and, start lobbying their representatives. Do you think that citizen, who may be working full-time, has other commitments, do you think that they would be able to compete against these professional lobbyists?
I think it is possible for citizens today to make a difference through their own campaigns. Every single day, we read in the newspapers, we hear even in our communities that individuals who take the initiatives by themselves, they were able to actually bend the policy process and convince or even block certain procedures. If you look at what is happening in Poland these days, a country that is very, very under the spotlight these days, you could see that this legislation that would have rendered the judiciary totally dependent on the will of the government was blocked by the protest and march made by the citizens over the last few days. So there is a lot of hope also in my own battles, those I take up every single day by helping grassroots organizations and NGOs to actually make a difference. And that despite the fact that we are very busy in our life. At the end of the day, what we are all looking for in life is not only financial reward or social status, but it's also about finding purpose. And purpose has to do with our ability to connect with our communities. So if we are able to contribute and to even make a small contribution that might have an impact to our area, in our city or in our region, in our country, our life is going to be set to become happier. And therefore, we are going to potentially feel much more attuned to what is happening in our society.
Can you take us through the stages of a successful citizen lobbying campaign?
Well, I think we always have to start from what we are very passionate about. I think there's no point in getting involved in campaigns that are promoting values or battles in which we don't believe in. So the most important point, I think, is step one, is pick your battle. Pick your battle is really about trying to identify what is really concerning us. And this might be something which has a very local impact, or it might be something bigger. But picking your battle is certainly step number one. And once we know what we care about, which might be animal welfare or LGBT rights, or making more transparent the way in which decisions are taken in our community, or perhaps making a little garden be preserved because that's where we bring our kids. It might be a playground, but it might be threatened by the construction of a new building. We need to do our homework. Means basically trying to figuring out what's been doing research on that particular issue, which is the evidence available to us. And then once we are ready to speak on behalf of the particular issue, we have to map the environment. Who are the enemies? Who are the people who want to actually threaten our objective? Who are our allies? And who might perhaps become a potential ally? There might be pre-existing organizations, there might be academics, politicians, think tankers who might actually share our view. And therefore, we could even build a coalition with them. And because of social media today, it's so easy to actually reach out and connect and to even mobilize those individuals in order to create a real coalition building there. And then once we are ready for this, yes?
Sorry, you say in the book as well that a lot of people don't realize that there's many professionals will actually give their services for free. It's something that started out with lawyers working pro bono, but now it's spread. There's organisations that look to hook up these professionals with different campaigns. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Today's knowledge is spread by definition. So it would be realistic to think that you as a citizens are going to be able to start a campaign and to fight of potentially very powerful organizations on your own. So there is a potential to actually knock the door to many people who are sharing the same objective you do. It might be, again, about LGBT rights or animal welfare or climate change, and to actually ask for their pro bono advice. Those individuals might be professionals who might want to do this during their office hours or outside of office hours. They might be academics, they might be analysts, they might be citizens like you who are actually keen on giving away some of their free time and to mobilize their expertise and talent to actually make your campaign successful. And that's something absolutely fundamental to realize today, that not only lawyers who historically have been providing pro bono advice to ensure access to justice are increasingly institutionalizing this form of pro bono volunteering, what I call skill-sharing volunteer, well beyond the legal profession. You have people working in communication, working in IT, working in social media, who might want to actually give you a hand in setting up your lobbying campaign. Of course, there's always a challenge of funding, because despite the fact you might receive pro bono advice, you might have to face certain costs in setting up your lobbying campaign. But is it possible today to crowdfund your own campaign? So you can, through your own webpage or dedicated platforms, to crowdfund your campaign in order to receive micro donations by individuals who share your objective and to actually get enough resources to pay your cost.
What mistake do first-time advocates most commonly make?
I think the most common mistake is not to prepare enough before going out and announcing to the public that you are ready to fight for a battle which might be particularly sensitive in that particular historical moment. So prepare is probably the most important part that most of the people omit by getting a bit carried away by the enthusiasm they have. And the second one is to give up as soon as your campaign reaches some results, meaning it gets amplified by the media, and perhaps you even obtain a meeting with decision makers. So you meet the minister, you meet the mayor of your own city. You tend to be feeling overwhelmed by this and even feeling somehow rewarded. And therefore, as a result, you might feel the temptation to give up on your campaign. But in reality, this is just the beginning of your campaign and your successful campaign. So you have to persevere as much as you can in order to keep going and to believe in what you are advocating for.
What do you think has been the greatest success using this approach? So what campaign sticks out in your mind as being, completely from the ground up unprofessional, as in amateur citizens, but became very successful?
In my book, I tell many stories, dozens of stories of successful citizens campaigns who actually made a difference for the many. I think the most successful one in terms of impact is the one led by my friend Max Krems, an Austrian law student who, when he was 26, decided to challenge before the actually Irish courts Facebook because it has been mistreating the data that were transferred to the United States without being in full conformity with European law. Max managed to crowdfund his campaign to challenge Facebook before the administrative courts in Ireland to get his case referred to the European Court of Justice, and many pro bono advisors actually helped him to the point that the Court of Justice actually decided that Max had a point, and Facebook had to comply with European law and to better treat the data of 500 million citizens living in Europe.
You teach these skills to university students. How did you yourself become interested in the subject?
Well, let's say that as an academic, I always felt that I need to go beyond my job description and to potentially bridge the gap between the ivory tower of academic research and what is out there, meaning society. So over the years, I became quite enthusiastic about the idea of mobilizing my own research and my free time for serving causes I was deeply caring about. So I began providing pro bono advice to leading NGOs like Amnesty International, Transparency International, Amnesty, as well as grassroots organizations. And I simply thought that what I was doing is something that everybody can do in academia and also in other professions. And that's the reason that pushed me to set up my community, the Good Lobby, which connects pro bono advisors with NGO and grassroots who are fighting for the most important causes of our life.
And of course, you say your organisation is called the Good Lobby. Academics sometimes take heat for teaming up with corporations to provide expertise where we don't know where the funding links are. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's correct. Historically, not only Europe, but also elsewhere, academics, because of their image of independence, have accepted to mobilize their own expertise in order to basically obtain financial rewards. And this has inevitably led a certain interest, notably corporate interest, to actually pay for those services. And that's what I call academic lobbying. My model is clearly answer to that by arguing that academics, because of their independence, actually are very well situated not to take part in those kind of disputes, but to provide from an independent standpoint element that might inform the public debate, and to do so on a pro bono basis clearly will further legitimize their involvement. Unfortunately, every single time money is involved, even the best academics and scientists might be perceived as simply monetizing their independence rather than providing a contribution to society.
Everyone obviously has been on Facebook or social media. You see these petitions going around. Great, maybe a very emotive picture. You put your name down, send it off into the void. We don't know where it goes. Now, your book makes a very clear distinction between something called a commercial petition and an official petition. So can you tell us what the difference is?
Yeah, today we witness the emergence of many engagement entrepreneurs, individuals who set up platforms that are able to capture our desire for participation, and they commodify our citizen engagement by collecting signatures. These forms of engagement are clearly commodified today, meaning that are very often driven by collection of data that are then repackaged and sold off. These forms of engagement clearly is not giving justice to our individual desire to participate in society. But of course, we also have institutional forms of collecting signature, different petition models that unfortunately are not able to be as successful as the commercial one to mobilize individuals simply because we do not happen to be on those web pages. So the future of citizen engagement through digital media will be to somehow find a balance and strike a balance between the appeal that commercial online sites do have with the independence and the institutionalization of these more conventional platforms that today most of European countries and beyond do provide citizens. This phenomenon is very often called Slack activism. So this idea that individuals often want to send a message to their peers. So it's very virtual signally to actually argue, well, I'm part of this conversation. I'm signing for this kind of petition. But inevitably they feel that their contribution could be greater than simply supporting those pre-framed, predefined campaigns.
How do you know? So how do you know what petition is, say, a good petition in the sense that it would have some kind of legal standing where it put before Parliament? So, does it have to be all citizens of the same country? Do you have to put your full name? Do you have to put your address? Is there any sign that you would know which one is a genuine petition?
Well, there's a lot of confusion out there for citizens to understand who is behind a particular campaign, in particular because today there is a phenomenon that we often call astroturfing, which is basically fake grassroots. So you have corporations who actually pay citizens to act on their behalf by looking independent citizens, but in reality we know they're actually paid, so they are de facto professional lobbyists. Having said so, I think it's important before taking part to any campaign to look at who is behind those campaigns. Are those citizens who actually come from a particular city, who come from a particular sector, and therefore can be easily be contacted? When those individuals, they react to you and to your inquiries, well, this is a good sign. These are people who are generally interested in having your support. If instead you look just a bit too professional, if you look just a bit too far away from where you are, perhaps you should exercise further scrutiny before actually embrace them.
You mentioned the word, I am familiar with astroturf, but just for our listeners who may not understand, what is astroturfing?
Astroturfing is about faking grassroots movement. It's about having citizens acting as citizens, but in reality paid by corporations to take a particular stance. We witness a lot of astroturfing in the chemical and pharmaceutical sectors, where corporations, when one of their substances, active substances, or pharmaceutical products and drugs, they get under scrutiny because there might be concerns. So there might be an interest by corporations to ask citizens to set up web pages, to create different kind of movements that provide the information, which in principle is independent information, but of course is not. And the lack of clarity about who is behind them makes astroturfing extremely difficult to spot today.
What about citizen lobbying? Obviously we had that terrible fire in the Grenfell Tower block in London, and the residents had been complaining about safety issues with their apartment block, but they hadn't got any movement from the council. Do you need middle-class connections to really get the ball rolling?
Well, I think the Grenfell Tower is a very dramatic illustration of what citizens could have avoided should have been able to move beyond the classic protest or complaints. So in that particular instance, should have been able to connect with fire engineers, with experts in that particular sectors, a few pro bono lawyers who would have been able to channel their complaints into a more institutionalized form of protest. Well, this possibly would have prevented the situation. But of course, for citizens who are not necessarily very well placed in terms of time at their disposal and literacy, it is extremely difficult to get there. And that's why it's important not only to have citizens on the ground willing to voice, but also to have organizations who act like watchdogs and who are able to empower those citizens by saying, well, in this situation, you should not simply send letters of complaints, but you should self-organize and to make a further step. So we need bottom-up and top-down approaches coming together in order to empower citizens in those very critical situations.
Getting fire engineers involved, all that stuff obviously would take quite a bit of money. So what are the kind of routes? Do you fundraise? How much money do you need really realistically to get a kind of campaign, say for a Grenfell Tower block or for improving your apartment blocks? How much money do you think that would take?
Well, if you look at the model of citizen lobbying I've been theorizing and practicing over the last few years, at the end of the day, what makes a difference in a critical situation like Grenfell is not necessarily to collect resources and money, but it's simply to connect to the right people in the right moment. So let's suppose that the Grenfell Tower inhabitants had the chance to create a Facebook page, to create mobilization sites that could have enabled them to get some visibility, also with journalists. And these journalists would have amplified and taken up this message. Well, this would have created some momentum for their claims that would have enabled them to connect not to people who would have paid for these services, but it would actually offer them on a pro bono basis. And that's exactly what social media actually can offer today. They are certainly far from being the best of what we can have, but this inevitably and unfortunately they also have a positive advantage, which is really to reconnect citizens with other actors they would have never met in person, but they could easily meet these individuals online basically by a distance of one click.
So you have these citizen lobbying is a great way to bring attention to an issue. What happens in the case where some activists are more committed than others? So I'm going to use it as an example. In America, there is quite a highly active campaign against breast cancer and prostate cancer. They have a big fundraising organisation. But there's a disease called emphysema and COPD. Basically, it's the third biggest killer, but because it's associated with smoking and poor lifestyle choices, it doesn't really get as much sympathy or people to be, to lobby on its behalf to the same extent. So shouldn't legislators be looking at disease burden first and foremost and not be swayed by sympathetic advocacy?
Well, that's clearly a problem today. There are certain battles that they lend themselves better to be communicated to the public and to become salient and therefore to mobilize actors. And I think the only way to somehow do justice to the complexity of many phenomena that are kind of horizontal or less salient today is to be able to create stories that might make those issues felt closer by citizens. So communication is one of the major steps that I think has to be taken up by any citizen lobbyist today. And also there, I think it is possible to identify people who are extremely powerful and creative in coming up with stories that can counter the tendency of certain phenomena to be felt closer by citizens. And there's a lot of research coming from behavioral sciences is explaining how, at the end of the day, what really makes the difference is how you frame a particular story. So trying to reverse the default, try to present issues that are absolutely socially accepted as unacceptable because you, for instance, internalize certain risks that people don't necessarily see. A big issue, of course, is tobacco and alcohol these days, might be the right way to change the environment in which citizens and decision makers will have to take a stance on a particular phenomenon.
Is it important to get a first-person perspective, or a human interest angle? You mentioned that a little bit in your book. How does that work?
Absolutely. I think any single time you start communicating about your battle and you try to explain why you care about an issue, you need to humanize that history. It might be you, it might be somebody you know, it might even be a fictitious stories you just set up in order to be sure that people will understand why you are so deeply concerned about that particular issue and why it matters for you, for society, and should actually matter for them. Just
to wrap up, can you tell us top 3 things that you say you have your issue in mind, you want to get active about it? What are the top 3 things, first 3 things you should do?
Well, the first thing is to ask yourself, am I ready? Am I ready for it? As soon as you pick your battle, you're going to get visibility. People are going to ask why you're actually doing what you're doing. And then you will be questioned. There will be journalists, there will be friends, families asking why you're actually doing it. So you need to be ready. And there's no better thing than preparing hard, doing your homework. making sure you know exactly why that particular issue is so important to you, and it should be important also for those surrounding you. And the third, which I think is the most difficult one, is to persevere. So to be sure that you will have enough bandwidth to work on that issue for at least 1, 2, 3 years, and you will be enlightened enough to be surrounded by like-minded individuals who will be happy to help. So you need to prepare.
Okay, Alberto, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks to you, Kim, for the opportunity.
You're listening to the Political Book Show podcast.